In the 20th century, in a country called England, there was a gathering of remarkable people destined to redefine the boundaries of faith, creativity, storytelling, and imagination. Through their shared love for stories and yearning for adventures, collaborate and explore new realms that only their hearts could see, and create stories that would never been read by anyone before, until they write them all down. In a little town called Oxford, two professors, once war veterans, found a long-lasting friendship with each other and a partner in crime to pick up their pens and write down what they saw in their hearts and dreams.
I mean, like,
when Fellowship of the Ring, it begins with a birthday party.
One of the inspiration points, though, was definitely in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, when he talks about a wood between worlds.
From the rolling hills of the Shire to the distant lands of Narnia, the legacy of JRR Tolkien and C.S. Lewis's partnership invites us on a journey that remains as captivating today as it was the day they first wrote their first drafts. This is the beginning of the adventure. Let's go back to the beginning, all the way back, before the creations of those worlds, where it all began, where the seeds of their creativity and inspiration was planted and watered before they were authors. In a country called England, in the late 19th century, two future authors were born into a world on the brink of transformation. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born on January 3, 1892, in Africa, though he was then raised in Birmingham. He's also known as Tollers by his close friends. And Clive Staples Lewis was born on 29 November 1898 in Belfast, Ireland. He was known as Jack to his family and friends, a nickname he made himself in honor of his dog Jaxie that was run over by a car when he was young, but for this case we'll still call these gentlemen by their last names. Since their youth, Tolkien and Lewis have always been fascinated by the rich lore of ancient myths, legends, fairy tales, and other stories that contain heroism and adventures. Though Tolkien went the extra mile on his hobby by learning languages and writing poems. Tolkien was introduced to these things by his mother Mabel. He also attended King Edward's School, where the seed of his first fellowship was planted. In 1910, he and a group of his friends who shared the same interest as him formed the Tea Club Barovian Society, a gathering where they'd share and discuss about the literature and creative writings. The group consisted of about 9 members, but 4 members attended the most: Tolkien himself, Geoffrey Bosch-Smith, Christopher Wiseman, and Robert Gilson. They'd frequently gathered at Barrow stores during these meetings. And Lewis grew up with many books his father Albert owned. Nature also played a pivotal role in shaping their imaginations and inspirations. Tolkien loved that his early years in the village of Sarahole were filled with the beauty of rolling hills, dense woodlands, and clear streams. Lewis also spent his childhood in embrace of nature in his garden home. These things that they experienced in their youths were the ones that influenced their writings later on. But despite the wonderful childhoods they had, it did not last long. Tolkien's early life was marked with hardship and loss. His father, Arthur Tolkien, passed away from a fever in Africa. This tragedy occurred when Tolkien was still very young and in England, so they received the news via letter. After his father's death, Mabel converted to a Catholic, a decision that led her family to disown her. At that time, converting to another religion wasn't really taken well in the eyes of society, unlike today. Despite these challenges, Mabel remained committed to her faith. This inspired Tolkien himself to keep his faith, and for later on in life for his work inspiration, saying that his mother was a martyr indeed, and it is not to everybody that God grants so easy a way to his great gifts as he did to Hilary and himself, giving them a mother who killed herself with labor and trouble to ensure them keeping the faith. But several years later, on November 14, 1904, Mabel died from diabetes at the age of 34. Tolkien was just 12 years old. He and Hilary were then raised by Father Francis. In another town, a few years later, Lewis went through a similar tragedy. The death of his mother in 1908 took a huge toll on him, and he was just 9 years old, too young to be without his mother. The grief of losing his mother shook his foundation of faith and led him away from Christianity, becoming an atheist for the rest of his young life and favored materialism. The death of his mother also put a strain on the relationship between father and sons, which made him feel lonely, especially when he and his brothers were sent to different boarding schools. How he returned to Christianity and became the man that we all know him as today is still far ahead, but before reaching that pivotal moment of his life, Tolkien and Lewis had to face a terrible moment in human history: World War I. In 1914, a shadow loomed over Europe and soon the entire world. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was a chain reaction that led to a deadly war. Countries after countries had to arm themselves and fight for their homes, and many men, young men especially, had to leave their family to fight. This was no different for Tolkien and Lewis, who were still in their early 20s in the start of the World War. Like many others, they found themselves drawn into the conflict and signing up for the armies. Tolkien served as a second lieutenant in the war. He was a recent graduate from Oxford and newlywed to his wife Edith. His role in the war brought him to the infamous and one of the bloodiest battles of World War I in October of 1916, the Battle of the Somme. This was warfare on an unimaginable scale, where the Allied forces sought to penetrate German defenses. The earth churned into a desolate moonscape, and skies darkened by the smoke of conflict. Amidst the grounds of no man's land, hundreds of thousands of young men faced horrors beyond comprehension. Machine gun fire mowing down advancing troops, the unseen terror of gas attacks, and the fires of cannons and explosions, taking countless lives from both sides. This battle stretched for 5 terrible months. Many men were killed that day. Bodies were scattered everywhere, both on land and in water. It wasn't even clear who won that battle, but one thing is for certain: it was a living nightmare. The Battle of Somme became one of the deadliest battles ever known in our history, a grim reminder of what mankind is capable of when turned against each other. It became a shadow for survivors, including young Tolkien, looming over his shoulders perhaps for his whole life. Not only had he witnessed weapons fired and death on the battlefield, but he also lost good friends and comrades, killed in the same battle. The nightmare he experienced in those tranches and the deep scars of losing his comrades affected him so greatly that many years after the battle had ended, he was still able to describe it in his works as if he was still there. They lie in all the pools, pale faces, deep, deep under the dark water. I saw them, grim faces and evil, and noble faces and sad. Many faces were proud and fair, and weeds in their silver hair, but all foul, all rotting, all dead. This was just one paragraph in a chapter that he described. Imagine what more he has to say in one whole book about the war. Eventually, after this deadly battle, Tolkien caught trench fever, which stopped him from being able to serve in the army and the front lines, and thus he returned to England and away from the war. Sadly, this battle was one of the countless other horrifying battles across Europe at that time, and a similar kind of tragedy also fell upon his soon-to-be best friend. Lewis signed himself up for duty in 1917, joining the British Army as a second lieutenant in the Somerset Light Infantry, his battalion, where he was serving in France. The Germans bombed his battalion near the French town of Rio-du-Vinage. That battle was just as horrifying and destructive. Soldiers were killed, and the wounded were screaming for help. He said that the frights, the cold, the smell of high explosives, the horribly smashed men still moving like half-crushed beetles. It was almost enough to dissuade him from advancing further in battle before another incident permanently brought him out of the field of war. Lewis barely survived in the spring of 1918 at the Battle of Arras. Amid war's relentless fury, where steel and fire reigned supreme, the battlefield bore witness to a chilling dance of destruction. Amidst this terrible conflict, it was here that things took a cruel turn. As the roar of explosions and the stench of smoke continued to fill the battlefield, a shell coming from his own country's artillery strayed tragically off course. Shrapnel tore through the air, bringing their armies down, including Lewis. Some didn't survive, including his sergeant. A loss felt deep. But Lewis and some of his other comrades did, rescued from the brink of death. Lewis was transported from the battlefield to a hospital, where his long road to recovery began. As a result of this accidental friendly fire, it marked the end of his active military service. During these trying times, Tolkien and Lewis never crossed paths, but the things they've been through during those battles were parallel. For Tolkien, the horrors and losses he experienced during the Battle of the Somme deeply affected him very much. Even more tragically, he also learned that most of his closest friends from the Tea Club Fellowship had perished in the war. Christopher Wiseman was the only one who survived. As for Lewis, it drove him deeper into atheism, questioning how God could let something horrific happen to his own creation. But at the same time, his heart was also yearning for a spiritual awakening to balm his sorrowed heart, especially after he learned that he lost his close friend Paddy Moore to this deadly war. There's a saying that if someone's forced to do something that they don't like, it'll feel like hours. And that's what they probably felt in the front lines as they fought their battles.
This is not something you can go away to. What do you know about that for what's happening right here, right now, with the PTSD of so many soldiers who come back. And I think it was up to 18 people a day, 18 soldiers with PTSD were killing themselves. This is a shocking thing.
November 11, 1918 marked the end of World War I, silencing the guns that had roared for over 40 years, and finally, peace was achieved. The world was able to breathe a sigh of relief, and soldiers were able to return home and to their families for good. Now that the war ended, Tolkien and Lewis returned to Oxford as teachers. Tolkien took the role of a teacher before becoming a professor of Anglo-Saxon later on, and explored literature and writing languages again. Lewis, on the other hand, became a tutor in English literature. Their time working there sharpened their writings to prepare themselves for the new world, or in this case, their world. This huge, prestigious university became their safe haven, and they can do what they are passionate about, where they could immerse themselves in the realms of academia, literature, and their imaginations. And now, years later, after all they had been through, God believed that it was time for these two to finally meet for the very first time, properly, to form something extraordinary, to form a strong bond, to ground their passion together, and to assemble a group of remarkable people for the stories we know today. And it all began with a party. May 11th, 1926. The University of Oxford is about to witness a legendary meeting. That day, there was a general strike about huge wage cuts, but long work hours between coal miners and their employers. This was a hot topic all over Britain, including Oxford. To support the strike, the operators of public transports did not run as scheduled. A lot of the transports were delayed, including Lewis's usual bus, which he usually took to go home. With the delay of his bus, for who knows how long, he had much spare time to give. And thus, he decided to go to Merton College for the 4 o'clock English tea, where many professors gathered to discuss the tedious issue of the strike. When Lewis joined the English tea party, he found that there were already important professors and tutors gathered, and among them was Professor Tolkien himself. In that singular, fateful, and unexpected meeting, thanks to the strike, the seeds of an extraordinary friendship were sown, and the two finally met with each other face to face. Now, you might think that these two brilliant minds would just click and connect. Two teachers of Oxford, smart, war veterans, how can they not get along when they first met? Well, they did not. Apparently, Lewis's first impression of Tolkien was that he was a smooth, pale, fluent little chap, and that he only needs a smack or two. Yes, he really said that. Not going so well, I suppose. So apparently, Tolkien had quite a sharp tongue when they were talking about certain topics. One of their arguments was how students should be taught. While Lewis considered English literature after Geoffrey Chaucer was better, Tolkien suggested students should concentrate on Old and Middle English writings. Perhaps the most blunt answer that Tolkien gave to Lewis about literature was that they are written for the amusement of men between 30 and 40. Professor Tolkien said it right to his face, an English literature teacher. It's no wonder Lewis wanted to smack him. And after that, I don't think they would be interested in meeting each other again often because of their differences. Perhaps just casual hellos when they pass by, and that's it. But then, one fateful day, their bad first impression of each other would completely change forever because of this one unexpected meeting again. This one gathering that solidified their friendship forever was the Coal-Biters Gathering that Tolkien made himself in 1926. He got the name from an Old Norse word called 𝗗𝗜𝗦𝗘, since it was a gathering where he'd read aloud some of the Old Norse stories in the language of Old Norse. And among the members who gathered to listen diligently to his discussions was none other than C.S. Lewis himself. He too was intrigued to be able to listen to Icelandic stories in their original language, and it's a lifelong dream of his. As he listened, he found that a lot of the literatures Tolkien discussed were about tales and stories that Lewis too loved as a child, and even in his adult life, and that piqued his interest even more upon knowing that Tolkien had a similar hobby as him. Once Lewis found an opening to speak with Tolkien, they spoke, and throughout their discussions, they found that they finally had a common ground. The past is finally behind them, and that was the spark that would start the fire of a legendary friendship and the influence of their creativity on each other. Over time, they would talk to no end, as if their first argument never happened. And perhaps during a time, they must have spoken about their childhood and found that they experienced something similar. They both lost their mothers, whom they adored very much. They were sent to a deadly battle for their country, yet it was their mutual love for storytelling that perhaps offered solace. The experiences and personal stories they shared connected them like long-lost childhood friends and brothers. And perhaps it's why Lewis said this. The typical expression of opening friendship would be something like, "What? You too? I thought I was the only one." One meetup then turned to years of hangouts. They would meet up more often and talk more about the stories they shamelessly loved their whole life without judgments, sharing their loves of dragons and adventures and many things that could be found in fairy tales. Their friendship also fell into a routine. Tolkien would find Lewis in his college on Monday mid-mornings, since it's the day when he's got no students to teach, and the two friends would either hang out at the Eastgate Hotel, Tolkien's house, college rooms of Lewis, or a public house for a drink, and they would continue to discuss about their hobbies to no end. Edith said that she was used to her husband coming home late from work, and one of the reasons was probably because he was hanging out too much with Lewis, discussing more about dragons and other tales. But those late-night hangouts and regular meetings that these gentlemen had were actually very essential. It wasn't so that it's because of their main stories, they didn't even know that. They just want to be good friends who talk about adventures and dragons. But the thing is, their friendship was actually the pinnacle that brought their careers to the top. So that's why, before writing their main stories, their friendship was actually very important in their lives. And Tolkien said it himself, friendship with Lewis compensates for much, and it did. At some point, when they both knew deep in their hearts that they were brothers in arms, Tolkien felt that he was ready to unveil to his best friend a world he saw that he feared to share with anybody else for a long time since the war. The stage is set, and Tolkien's about to draw back the curtains on a tale about an epic adventure of a lifetime that only he had seen, but was now ready to share with Lewis. Backing up a little bit, as mentioned at the start, Tolkien has been into languages since his teenage years, so you could say that the first creation of the lore of Middle-earth could be dated back to when he created the Elvish language when he was a teenager, and then over the years, he developed it into a nearly full-fledged language and made even more languages. It was said that he constructed at least 15 different Elvish languages with their dialects such as Sindarin and Quenya. After that language development, it became the spark for him to create the Lords of Middle-earth, where actually, the first tale he ever made of that series was the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐼𝐴, and one of the first stories he had ever written for it was about Beren and Luthien, or the Lay of Luthien. It was a personal poem about his own life, detailing the challenges he faced when he asked for his wife's hand in marriage. A story about a mortal man called Beren, who fell in love with an elf princess called Luthien, and she for him. But her father, King Thingol, wouldn't allow this romance to happen. But regardless, Beren and Luthien are still in love anyways, and they both insist on getting married. So, to make things worse for the couples, King Thingol sent Beren on a journey to retrieve a jewel. And to find out more about how he'll get the jewel, you're gonna have to buy the book, Beren and Luthien. That was one of the very first stories he developed, and guess who gets to read it first? That's right, it's none other than his best friend, C.S. Lewis. A quick note, Tolkien was a perfectionist, so like most perfectionists, he always thought that his writing was terrible and that he's an amateur writer. He's even afraid of what people thought about his work. But here he was, finally ready to show his very first draft to someone other than himself. Thanks to their quality time together over the past few years, feeling a great amount of trust in each other, Tolkien allowed his best friend to read his poem story, and Lewis gladly accepted it and read it at home. Upon reading it, Lewis was truly impressed with the story that he wrote a letter to him saying that he had enjoyed the poem just as well as if he picked it up in a bookshop by an unknown author. The two things that come out are the sense of reality in the background and the mythical value. 3 weeks later, Tolkien received a 14-page of feedback about his poem. The funny part is that Lewis even rewritten major parts of the poem himself. You might think that Tolkien will be discouraged after reading his friends' criticisms and feedbacks that he should go further on his writing, but no, it actually became his fuel to expand his world, and that his creative gear can turn again after hiding it for so long. For years, he had struggled to motivate himself to finish his Middle-earth stories, fearing that people might find his world terrible. But now, knowing that his best friend, a scholar like him, loved it and took his story and vision to heart, he gained the confidence to write some more. With the first step of their friendship in sharing writings, sometime later, after Tolkien showed his poem to Lewis, Lewis also showed his very own poem to Tolkien. And just like what he did, Tolkien also shared his thoughts to Lewis. Together, they collaborated to further sharpen their skills in storytelling. This marked their first teamwork together, and if they were serious about creating better stories, they knew they couldn't do it alone or with just two people. The realization that if they were to truly dedicate themselves to crafting a solid story entirely their own, unseen by anyone but them, they would need to expand their horizons. What they needed was not just another helping hand, but a team united by a shared vision and passion. Above all, they needed a fellowship. No one seemed to be more enthusiastic about stories just as Tolkien and Lewis were, so the gathering of the coal-biters kind of dissolved. These men knew that they're gonna need more people to inspire their writings and go further. An assistance, you can say. It has to go beyond. Beyond the subjects they read in libraries. Beyond the genres that people find in bookstores. It had to be from the heart, where no one have ever seen but the authors themselves. And to ensure that their stories are legit and read by all, Tolkien made a rule for the new gathering, which was, members should read aloud unpublished compositions. These were supposed to be open to immediate criticisms. Now, they just needed a new name for the rebranding of the club. Something new. Something that would represent a whole new generation of writers and authors of their time. Before the formation of Tolkien and Lewis's new club, there was an undergraduate at Oxford called Edward Tangelline, who had a keen interest in academics and literature. He founded a literary club in 1931, but it didn't last after he left Oxford in 1933. That's right, the name of that club that he founded was none other than the Inklings, which Tolkien and Lewis were once part of as university staff. Upon hearing this name, it impressed both scholars, and they both agreed to revive the name. And right there and then was the origin name of the fellowship, where history would soon be made, and more members would soon join the party. The Inklings were formed informally without any sort of administrations from the school, so most likely no one really knew much about the gathering other than being elderly best friends hanging out together. But in the 1930s, there were people noticing a group of elderly gentlemen gathering on Thursdays in the famous pub of the Eagle and Child. Sometimes, other people like students would join in for the fun of it. But it wasn't the place where their creation, writings, and storytelling happened, since it was more of a place to kick back and unwind. The real work took place on Tuesdays in Lewis's Magdalen College rooms, where the creation of their magic happened, and a large number of discussions about literature were discussed over smokes and pipes, and several pens and papers, and sharing a lot of ideas. It was said there were about 19 members who joined the club, including Tolkien and Lewis. This little fellowship was a huge assistance to both Tolkien and Lewis, particularly because two notable members of the Inklings assisted their writings a lot, aside each other, Charles Williams and Owen Barfield. Charles Williams was known to be a fiction and philosophy author and poet. One of his famous works was The Place of the Lion, which was the book that inspired both Tolkien and Lewis when they created their worlds, myths, and writings. As for Owen Barfield, he was a longtime friend of Lewis since they were students at Oxford. He was also a philosopher, poet, and lawyer too. He was also one of the people who spoke to Lewis about Christianity and shared in-depth philosophy 101 with Tolkien and Lewis as they developed their lores. You may also know his daughter in the very beginning of the book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Lewis wrote a letter to Lucy Barfield, telling her that the book was meant to be for her. So as you can see, the little fellowship was a pretty rad group for these gentlemen, having a vision to create stories of their own, exploring new boundaries. As stated before, the Inklings were formed so that everyone can sharpen their minds and creativity, and they can discuss whatever they want. And it's probably a huge assistance for all as well, particularly for Lewis because at that time, he was questioning his atheist belief. And funny enough, he questioned that part when he was at the Whipsnade Zoo in 1930 with his brother Warren, or Warnie, as most people would call him. Anyways, there were many discussions he had during his process of conversion. He spoke to Hugo Dyson, a fellow member of the Inklings, where he showed how imagination and reason can be combined in literature. Owen Barfield and Charles Williams were also significantly responsible for opening up about Christianity to Lewis. But the huge turning point was when he had a deep conversation with Tolkien that finally made him move out of atheism. In the early autumn of September, when the leaves turned bright orange, along the River Cherwell near Magdalen College, Tolkien and Lewis were talking, a talk that would change the life and beliefs of C.S. Lewis thanks to his best friend. It was a long, deep conversation, a talk that would become the most important moment in his life. There were many things that they discussed, but one of the most important words Lewis recounted that Tolkien told him was that the account of Christ and his death and resurrection is a kind of myth, he explained. It works on our imagination in much the same way as other myths. With this difference, it really happened. At that moment, Lewis is coming to terms that Jesus was real. And shortly, later on, he became a Christian and a devoted follower of Jesus Christ. Though Tolkien must have felt a little bit upset because when they had that long intellectual discussion, he was trying to get Lewis to be a Roman Catholic like him. But that didn't happen. But otherwise, Lewis became a proud follower of Jesus Christ thanks to Tolkien. He also began writing many theological books that are still being sold today. And that was how he became a well-known author about Christianity before he wrote The Story Beyond the Wardrobe. With all the paths coming together and the whole picture is set, this is where the adventure begins. Lewis's enthusiasm for Tolkien's new myth was the replenished energy that Tolkien needed to continue the Middle-earth stories and turn on his creative side again. While the Silmarillion was written first and not finished yet, Tolkien wanted to finish another kind of story. Something a little bit more for young kids since he reads bedtime stories to his children, and he had actually written it long before he met Lewis. It was a story that was long on hiatus until Lewis snapped him out of his writer's block and got his pen back on the paper. At the beginning of the page of the preface of The Hobbit, Tolkien said, "All I remember about the start of The Hobbit is sitting correcting school certificate papers in the everlasting weariness of that annual task force on impecunious academics with children. On the blank leaf, I scrawled, 'In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit.' I did not and do not know why. I did nothing about it for a long time, but it became The Hobbit in the early 1930s. It wasn't really documented when Tolkien showed Lewis The Hobbit, but it seems that Lewis's enthusiasm and encouragement actually got him, including his children's. In fact, his youngest son, Christopher Tolkien, loved the story so much that when his father read it as a bedtime story to him and his siblings when they were children, he would find some inconsistencies when his father told the stories at times, such as the colors of Bilbo's front door. His father would say that it was blue, but the next day, when he told the story again, the blue front door would become green, and Christopher would point this out to his father. It actually annoyed Tolkien greatly that he muttered under his breath, "Damn the boy," before striding across the room to his desk to make a note. However, Lewis, as his equal, was Tolkien's biggest motivator. Lewis read it with passion, feeling as if he were a child who finally got his hands on a new book from the store. He stopped everything when he got a hold of the manuscript, taking in every word that his best friend wrote, reading the story that first began in the simple town of the Shires to the dangerous abandoned castle in the lonely mountain, where the great dragon Smaug dwells. And he loved it. He even wrote to a friend about it. "Since term began, I have read a delightful time reading a children's story which Tolkien has just written." Those encouragements and enthusiasms from his best friend and his children were the drive that brought up his courage to write the story, finish it, bring the manuscript to a publisher, and finally, let the whole world read his story and the world he saw. Once the books hit the stores, Tolkien's anxiety that people would hate it did not dwell long, nor did he have to worry about it from the start. And Lewis was right to keep nagging his best friend to publish the book. The Hobbit was first released to the public on September 21, 1937. Several months later, it was sold out. That was how successful his first published story of the Middle-earth series was. Tolkien was relieved that his story was received well, and that became his new fuel to expand the lore and to create the main biggest story, The New Hobbit. But to create the new book, it was at the cost of putting his prequel story, The Silmarillion, aside again. But the vision of the sequel was so clear in his mind that it was just too bright to ignore it. And thus, he chose The New Hobbit and began working. For the next days, months, and years, following the success of The Hobbit, Tolkien worked furiously again on his new sequel. It was during that period of creation that Tolkien decided to change the initial title of the book into something brand new that we all know today: The Lord of the Rings. And as he worked on chapters of the new book, his best friend continued offering keen insights, feedbacks, and encouragements. But at some point, during their usual gathering, as he was about to read his story aloud to everyone, one of the members, Hugo Dyson, heaved a sigh as he laid back on the sofa, muttering, "Oh God, no more elves." And Tolkien heard it, and he must have felt deeply upset by that comment, for perfectionists are great critics of themselves. If they couldn't even handle their own critics, how can they handle coming from other people? That includes Tolkien. Thus, that was the last straw that The Lord of the Rings was ever read aloud or given to any Inkling meetups and members. Save for one person, the one and only who was there for him since the very beginning, Mr. C.S. Lewis himself. So the meme about Lewis being the one who said that he disliked elves was pretty much false. What Lewis did somewhat complain to Tolkien about is that he thinks that there's too much of hobbits and their ways at the beginning. But Tolkien thought that that part of the story was necessary. So from 1937 to 1954, Tolkien kept writing chapter after chapter, and he gave it to Lewis to read chapter after chapter as well, giving his best friend constructive feedback. To say that they continued like this, which brought their friendship stronger, would somewhat be a lie. For as much as these two had been close as brothers, there were times that they did kinda hate each other and had a complex friendship. One could say that it nearly tore their friendship apart if it weren't for the strong bond they had before sharing their big projects. As stated before, Tolkien wasn't particularly fond of Lewis converting to Christianity, and when Lewis is passionate about something, he can be quite vocal about it. We can see it in his philosophy books such as Surprised by Joy, Mere Christianity, The Problem with Pain, and many more. All of these books covered a lot of philosophies and his view of life through the lens of being a Christian in his understanding. And since both authors were philosophers and followers of Christ, you can kind of guess how much of an intense intellectual debate they had, especially about religion. Aside from that, they also had their fair share of arguments over their writings, particularly towards Lewis when he introduced his magical world beyond the wardrobe later on. Like Tolkien, Lewis also read aloud his story to his best friend, but being a perfectionist, Tolkien has quite a lot to say about the story. As a perfectionist, the way they show their love and care is, I'll tell you what's wrong with you. Now, don't blame them for being this way. It's how perfectionists work. Anyways, Tolkien was totally honest to Lewis after reading the first few chapters of the story and told him that it was really terrible. Lewis was extremely stunned by his best friend's feedback. In fact, his critique got him so badly that he threw the drafts away. Now, how did that first draft dig itself out of the garbage? We'll have to wait for the next chapter. Anyways, that did put a strain on their friendship, but despite their arguments and differences, Tolkien and Lewis still remained friends. The English tutor of Oxford continued to study the Lord of the Rings chapters meticulously, and the professor of Anglo-Saxon continued to share his chapters with him for review. There were times when Tolkien wasn't too consistent writing his story, which took him longer to complete the book. He went through several writer's block and hiatus as he wrote the chapters. Lewis, on the other hand, was a self-motivator. Throughout his lifetime, he would publish more books than Tolkien did. So at one point, and it wasn't documented whether he did it on purpose, because his best friend took too long to write Lord of the Rings, and perhaps he saw him somewhat slacking off on the project, he indirectly scolded him by teasing the coming creation of the book in his own published 1945 book, The Hideous Strength, stating, "Those who would like to learn further about Numenor and the true West must, alas, await the publication of much that still exists only in the manuscript of my friend, Professor JRR Tolkien." Side note though, he misspelled Numenor. Tolkien seemed to notice the names, making him realize that he had to clear things up because his friend misspelled his world's name. Thus, Tolkien got back to work, writing them again and letting his #1 fan read them for the next few years later. And finally, it was the fall of 1949, when the leaves turned as bright as the sunrise and the trees were preparing for the coming of a new season. Professor Tolkien finished writing the last chapter and ultimately the whole story of The Lord of the Rings. At long last, after decades of planning and writing, the long-awaited adventure of Frodo Baggins and the wars for the One Ring, The Lord of the Rings has finally been completed. The professor shed a tear, looking proudly at his lifelong creation. No doubt that he was absolutely joyful of this moment. It has been a long journey, and soon his work will be ready for publication. Quickly, he sent the typescript to his best friend to review as usual, and patiently, he waited for his response. And by the way, that typescript was typed together with his daughter, Priscilla Tolkien. And the map was drawn together with his son, Christopher Tolkien. So a lot is at stake here. They too must have felt how exciting this work would turn out to be, believing in their father's work. When the mailman arrives, he quickly rushed out to receive his best friend's letter. He tore open the envelope, unfolded the paper, and read it. Moments later, a huge grin lifted his face when he finished the last sentence, stating, "I congratulate you. All the long years you have spent on it are justified." This was Tolkien's final judgment that it was good to go. He was more confident than ever to share his second finished story of the Middle-earth with the world. But he didn't publish the book just yet because he wanted to release it alongside with his other unfinished prequel story, The Silmarillion, which details the richer lore of Middle-earth. But if you've read The Silmarillion, you'll find that it's a very complex book to read. And just as it is complex to read, it was also not easy to come up with all the history of Middle-earth since the beginning of its creations, and it's really the genesis of Middle-earth. And the book can be quite dark, especially when reaching the Second Age. Because of this, it delayed the release date of the book years later. The publishing company, Allen and Unwin, and the person in charge, Rayner Unwin, who also helped publish The Hobbit, recommended to Tolkien that releasing the Silmarillion is unnecessary. Somehow, this led to an argument between the author and the publisher that he went to another publisher called HarperCollins. The person in charge of Tolkien, Milton Walden, was interested in publishing the book, and he suggested to him that because the book was way too long, it had to be cut down. Hence, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Tolkien agreed to it, but it caused further delays on the release date, leaving him frustrated that the book was never published for a solid 3 years. In 1952, Tolkien declined to publish the book with HarperCollins, and the publisher also declined the contracts they made together, leaving Tolkien quite desperate and without any publishers. Somehow, Unwin knew about his troubled situation and managed to contact him again, saying to the professor, "Hey, we just want to let you know that no matter what your decision was with us, our door will always be open for you." Tolkien must have felt bad at first that he turned away from his former publisher, but seeing his financial situation and fearing that he'd end up poor, he agreed to give it a go again with him, and was willing to agree to whatever he suggested so long as the book was published. He replied to their agreements and went back to revising several of his appendices, maps, and other illustrations. The next concern is the economy and the marketing of the book, because the publication gap between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings was 17 years. So they had to do something to bring back their audience after such a long time. Now, the concept of marketing wasn't as big as it is today, and due to the post-World War II economic conditions, there were fears from both publisher and author that the book might not sell. So there were two strategies that they had to do. One was to lower the price of the book, which they had already done, and hence the other reason why the division into 3 books. And 2 is the marketing. It's not said whether they used big ads such as posters to post everywhere across the UK to sell the book, though I highly doubt it because it'll take a lot more expenses, and publishers were skeptical whether the book could sell. So they sought for reviewers as their marketers. Tolkien gathered validated reviewers to put their comments on the dust jacket of the book, and among the validated reviewers was none other than Tolkien's best friend and first reviewer from the very start, C.S. Lewis himself. Before The Lord of the Rings, Lewis was quite an established author already, having written several books about Christianity and fiction, like the popular Screwtape Letters, which was also written for Tolkien. And he appeared in several broadcast radio, so his name was quite well known, even before his main book. But like many well-known people, there would be haters as well, because of his passion for Christianity, and sometimes well known for speaking his mind out loud on any kind of platform. There were times when he was controversial in what he spoke about. Now it's hard to understand what people thought were controversial back then, and it happened long ago, so let's just leave it alone. Anyways, Tolkien and the publishers knew that putting Lewis's name on the book may cause a rift in the reader's reception whether they would buy the book or not. Even Lewis himself told his best friend that it's better not to put his name on the book because it might hurt the sales, but Tolkien thought otherwise. As said before, Lewis was always his #1 fan, and Tolkien said, "Lewis was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. But for his interest and unceasing eagerness for more, I should never have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion." And so, feeling in debt to his best friend, unafraid of his association with him no matter the haters, and against all the advice not to put Lewis's name on the book, he was still determined to place his best friend's name as part of the endorsement anyway. Now, finally, the book is ready to hit the shelves. The first book, The Fellowship of the Ring, was published on 29th July 1954. The Two Towers was published on 11th November 1954, and the last book, The Return of the King, was published on 20th October 1955. Those books were successful during their respective release dates in the UK. They even got a hard copy by the US publisher, Houghton Mifflin. In 1957, the trilogy was awarded the International Fantasy Award, and even Lewis, feeling proud of his best friend's work, nominated him for the Nobel Prize in Literature. The trilogy then became a lot more popular. The Lord of the Rings was a huge success even to this day, and has become a timeless classic for generations to come. With that success, Tolkien continued his academic career and continued his other literary projects, namely the 𝗗𝗏𝗧𝗏. And he still hung out with his fellow Inklings friends and his best friend, Lewis. The story of Middle-earth is still beloved to this day. It managed to become an animated cartoon in the 80s, but it became even more successful thanks to the direction of Peter Jackson and his team, who made a huge blockbuster success years later. And to this day, you'll find people gathered together still talking about the series passionately, discussing its profound theme, and exploring its rich lores. As we sail away from the epic story of Middle-earth, a new beginning calls to us, crafted by the hand of Tolkien's best friend who journeyed with him through Middle-earth. And now, he welcomes us to a new world, a world beyond the wardrobe, filled with talking animals, ruled by a great lion. The torch of fantasy is passed, and a brand new adventure awaits in the lands of Narnia.